sit back, relax, and let's have a chapter chat. I'm your host, Jessica Foster. I'm so excited about today's episode because we have a memoir that we'll be talking about today, Children Like Us. We have author Dr. Brittany Penner here with us today. She is a physician, a lecturer, and an author. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And Children Like Us is an adoption story. It's about connection. It also talks about heartache at the same time. It is multi-layered.
It is, yeah.
Tell me how difficult it was, or was it difficult to share this story?
I think it was probably easier than even I anticipated, and easier than many people have thought it would be, just because of the nature of everything that's written about in the book. I had read the trigger. There's a trigger content warning at the beginning of the book, and it lists many topics. And there were moments, I think, that were difficult, especially when it came to writing about people that I hold quite close and whom I love very much, and just wanting to do our relationship justice and wanting to take great care and not writing anything that might cause harm, but still staying true to the story and my experience. And so there were difficult aspects like that, but it wasn't as difficult as maybe even I thought, writing about some of my most vulnerable parts.
For people who haven't read it, give us a little synopsis.
Well, it tells the story of my life as an adopted child during the 60s scoop. And for those who aren't familiar with it, which I imagine many, if not most Americans wouldn't be, because many Canadians aren't, the 60s scoop was a period in Canada that started in the late 1950s. And the name is kind of misleading because it spanned several decades. So it went from the late 1950s to the early 1990s, so 1991, where Indigenous children were either removed or relinquished into the care of the government. And then the government took it upon themselves to place Indigenous children with non-Indigenous families, largely Caucasian families, but not always. And it was seen as an extension of the residential school system, where the foundational principle of the residential school system was to kill the Indian and save the man. So kill the Indian and save the child, and essentially was cultural genocide. And the 60s scoop was seen as an extension of that once residential or boarding schools started phasing out. And the book explores my experience as an Indigenous child adopted to a Mennonite family. They adopted and fostered many children. And so I grew up with 21 foster siblings throughout the span of my early life, where I kind of intuited the message, or learned the message, that to be Indigenous meant that you were not raised within your family or your culture. And that was because there was something kind of inherently wrong with us. And that was very much a learned message, not necessarily within my family, but more so even within the societal and cultural context in the wider picture across Canada. And then in later years, I went into medicine, and that is a whole other world where there's a lot of anti-Indigenous racism to experience and to witness, especially in our system. And so it shows me navigating that as well.
And I think that you're very vulnerable in your book. And it's important, though, with topics like this, to be vulnerable.
I think so. And I think, if I'm honest, definitely vulnerable. And I took it felt like I had a responsibility to be honest in that way with my story. But I was also I tried to be vulnerable in the things that I don't necessarily include either. How would I say this? It takes, I think, vulnerability to share your experience. And I think it also takes vulnerability and courage to leave some things out of the book and off of the page, in order to preserve relationships as well, and trust the reader that they can have what they need in order to kind of piece together the whole story, if that makes sense.
Do you recall as a child always questioning your identity, or was it when you reached a certain age?
Always, always. And I think part of that probably came from um being a child who looked nothing like my adoptive parents, and knowing that there was something very different about us as kids and our parents, as adoptive parents. And um, I think back even to the times when I played with my dolls and my Barbies as early as 3 or 4, and all of the darker skinned ones and all of the brown ones were adopted without question. And all of the light skinned ones or blonde ones were never adopted. And that was because that was just our world. And so there was always the nagging question of what is wrong with me, that this was the case, that my birth family at the time when I was a child, because children, our minds think like this. My question was, why was I not wanted?
Do you think that there was anything that could have been done in your childhood to make you not feel that way?
I think so. I think that there's something to be said about having really, I mean, age appropriate, of course, but having really open conversations, and perhaps planting certain seeds of, because it's a very complicated issue. It's a very layered issue I think in many cases in adoption, but especially ours with the history behind it. When I say ours, I mean mine and my cousins and my foster siblings. And I always struggled with the comment, even when I was a young child, that your birth mom loved you so much that she gave you to another family. The simplicity in that was difficult for me to appreciate, even as a young child, because I thought, well, I love my cat, or like, I love my dog. I'd never want to give them to someone else. And I think that it's rarely ever that simple. And I think that when I was a child, and even now, having honest conversations about the non-simplicity of it would have helped me. And perhaps other children are different, or other personalities are different, but I know for me that would have been something that would have helped me perhaps trust the bond between me and my parents a bit more, if that was something that was talked about. The book talks about this a lot with um, my foster siblings came and then they went, and I could never fully appreciate or understand why my foster siblings could return to their families, but I never did, or I never could. Um, and I think even a parent discussing that with me would have been something that would have gone a long way.
And you did meet your birth family.
I did. Or my birth mother, I should say.
Talk to me a little bit about that experience.
That was, I thought I was prepared. I had gone in kind of listing all of the different ways that it could play out, because I knew certainly of some really difficult stories and some relationships not going well. And I had thought that I had prepared for it, but I think that there's no preparing. There's preparing to an extent, but there's ultimately no preparing in full for that. And I had met her when I was about in my early 20s. And the one thing that I had not prepared for was the grief that came with it, because once I met her, she was this very real person who looked more like me than, or perhaps I looked more like her than I could have anticipated. And all of a sudden, she became a very real person whom I had lost once already, and whom I could lose again. And the grief of that initial loss was something that I had never wrestled with. And when she became very real in the way that I could look at her and hug her and touch her, um, the grief all of a sudden became very real.
And you talk a lot about the 60s scoop and what was going on in Canada.
Mhm.
But your birth mother and your adopted parents, they wouldn't necessarily say that your adoption was part of that, correct?
Yeah, they struggled to. I think it's probably coming from different places for both sides. Um, and I think the perspectives are maybe a bit different now, once we've talked about it a bit more and once it's something that's becoming a bit more accepted that it is a practice or a time in Canada that did last as long as it did. But initially it was something that both were reluctant to kind of see it in that light.
And as a mom now yourself, you have a newborn, you were telling me.
Mhm.
How has that changed your outlook, or has it?
It has, and again, it's something that um, I prepared for the kind of typical parenting stuff. Although, again, this is one of those things where you can't quite prepare for. You can think you're prepared to become a parent, but then you become one, and you realize how unprepared you are. Um, but one thing that has continually surprised me is the ways in which I'm viewing my adoption and my relationships with both sides, my adoptive parents and my biological mother. I'm continually surprised by how that's reshaping. Me becoming a parent is reshaping that. And for instance, in the first couple of weeks of being home with my daughter, I would just hold her, and there was a certain level of sadness because the first couple of weeks when I was born, I was with a foster family. So I was born, my birth mother never held me. She didn't quite frankly know the color of my eyes before she left the hospital. And the pain of of that truth. And when I was holding my daughter and looking at her eyes and looking at her little nails on her little fingers, and the pain of having this child and not knowing what could have, if I were in my birth mother's position, what would have happened to her, and not knowing what her forehead felt leaning against my chin when I had her on my chest, or not knowing the color of her eyes. That was something that brought me to tears in the first couple days. And I had come across a photo of my adoptive father holding me for the first time, and the look on his face. I don't know if well, I've seen that look now as he holds my daughter. Um, but it was a look that I haven't quite seen before. And I don't know if I ever appreciated that photo in the way that I do now. Um, and it's given me a new appreciation for what he and my mother must have felt when they first met me as well.
And in full disclosure, I am an adoptive mother. We adopted our daughter when she was an infant. And I know as an adoptive mother, I've always tried to have a very open line of communication and tell my daughter that, no question is off the table. We've been
Mm.
open about her adoption from a very early age. And my hope and my prayer is that we always give her what she needs to feel complete. And if we don't, that she lets us know that so that we can help her find those answers.
Hmm.
And
Yeah, that's so beautiful.
do you have any advice as an adoptee yourself to me as a mother who adopted a child?
I think, um, and you and I don't know each other well, because we just met today. And so I hope it's okay that I say this. Um, but I think that there's something to be said about um, understanding to be an adoptive mother. I'm not an adoptive mother, and so I don't know what it is to be on that side of things. Um, but I can only imagine that even with kind of all of the work in the world, that there might be moments of insecurity, um, when thinking about the biological mother in particular. And maybe I'm wrong, and maybe that's just my individual experience of seeing my own adoptive mom, and my baba, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother was very involved in raising me, my adoptive maternal grandmother. And I saw her go through this as well, where there were definite moments where they felt threatened, when thinking or talking about my biological mother. And then even more so when she came into the picture. And I think that there's not anything necessarily wrong with that. Um, and I think as an adoptive mom, taking care of yourself in that way can only help you and your child or children as well. And so I would just encourage adoptive parents, um, to be aware of that and to be aware of their own feelings around all of that. Because if you're aware of it, then it's not something that you're likely going to weaponize or even unknowingly pass on to your child. Because as an adoptive child, I think it's not an uncommon experience for kids to feel responsible. And again, maybe this is just my experience, but I felt like when I met my or when I would even talk about my biological family and ask questions, I also felt this very real responsibility to take care of my mom in that moment and in those moments that followed. And I don't think it has to be that way. And I think that's one thing that comes to mind when I think of that.
Yeah, and one thing that I've always tried to wrap my head around is that, human connections are complex. Relationships are complex. They always have been, they always will be in this world that we live in. But when you have a child who's been adopted, I do think that each of those families has played such a vital role in that child's life and will continue throughout their lifetime.
Definitely.
And I think that sometimes people want to act like, oh, everything is beautiful and wonderful. And adoption can be beautiful and wonderful. But there is some loss associated with adoption that we have to recognize and deal with as well.
Yeah, and I think there's loss on in so many ways too. There's loss for some adoptive parents, because the route to adoption not uncommonly also includes the story of infertility. Um, and then there's loss for the biological family. There's loss for the adopted child. There's a lot of, like you said, beauty and gifts and a lot that's gained, and also in that same kind of, with one hand you're holding this beautiful gift and this family that wouldn't exist without these losses, and then you're also holding loss of another life that could have been lived, in terms of the child with their biological family. um, and so I tend to think that those are the stories that are the most beautiful. And I think that so many of our lives hold both. But you're right in that adopted families and adopted children and adoptive parents, the lives often include that there is always that blending of both.
And I think that sometimes I feel like, well, every situation is unique, but I actually felt the calling to adopt from a very young age.
Mm,
And I remember telling my now husband, but it was when we were in college. And I said, hey, there's a question I need to ask you. I don't know why I feel like I need to ask you this right now, but if we ever get married and I would love to adopt a baby, would you be open to adopting a child? I have to know the answer to this. And he told me, well, sure. He's probably thinking, why in the world is this my college age girlfriend asking me this question? But I just had this, I felt a deep calling to do that. Um, And then it ended up, life circumstances, that is the path that we ended up taking. Had a unique conversation with my daughter on the way to school not too long ago. And she's a preteen now. And she said, "Hey, Mommy, I've been thinking, I think when I grow up, I want to adopt, just like I was." And I told her, hey, I mean, if that's your calling, I think that that's great if that's your calling and that's what you want to do. I know that some families don't feel that calling, and I feel like if you don't feel that calling, it's not something that you should pursue because it's so layered.
Yeah, that's so interesting. You're not the first person that's told me that. And in fact, I have a good friend, a good couple friend, where she would say very much the similar, like a very similar thing. And they, again, life circumstances led to them adopting their child, but it was something that she had felt, I think she had said as early as at some point in her childhood. Um, and I think what you said at the end there was really wise.
What do you hope that people get out of the book when they're reading it?
I think I first and foremost hope that some indigenous readers will read it and feel perhaps seen and a little less alone, and even if it's not the exact same story that they would have, but just a sense of community maybe, and a sense of being a little less alone. And I hope that I really do hope that it encourages readers to look into the 60s scoop and into the history of residential schools and into the history of the relations with Indigenous people across not only Canada, but in the US, because this was something that happened across the US as well. Um, I think a big thing I really hope for readers, whether they're Indigenous or not, is that we can look at stories like mine and see and feel the capacity to hold so many different layers of our own stories and to reckon with them. Because I think once we're able to look at the truth of all of it, and the hard and the beautiful and the joyous and the grief, we once we're able to kind of look at all of that and hold it with maybe a bit more compassion for ourselves, I think we're able to do that for others as well. And I think that is one of the biggest gifts that we can give not only ourselves, but those around us.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that is a beautiful way to say that. I think that we have to recognize all of the feelings. And I know that when you were writing this book, you said that you were trying to be sensitive really to everyone in that adoption triad. So, birth families, the adoptee, the adoptive parents. And was that a difficult balancing act?
It was. That I would say was more difficult than writing out the hard parts of my story. And the difficulty came in not knowing how it might be perceived, and really not having any control over that. And so with each moment that I wrote about that involved other people, I was kind of always asking myself, is sharing this going to contribute to the overall telling of my story? Is it going to, um, does it have the chance to bring more healing to either myself or someone reading this, or the other people that I'm kind of writing about? Or would writing this ultimately, could it risk hurting them in ways that I might not even see? And if the scales balance towards that, I would opt to either hold off writing about it and then come back to it a different day, or not write about it at all. Um, because once something is said, once something is written, you can't unwrite it, you can't unpublish it. And so it was something that I took a lot of. That was the biggest difficulty in doing this.
And you said this was the first time that you've spoken to someone who read the book, who is also a mom who adopted.
Hmm.
And I really enjoyed reading it. And I don't know if it's my personality or because I'm a journalist, but I do love looking at all sides of an issue, and I realize the complexity of issues. And I think that when we hear other people's perspectives, I think that it helps us be a better person overall.
I agree with that. And even hearing you say that, um, it's really nice for me to hear too.
What is your relationship like now with your birth family and also your adoptive family?
My birth family, it is something that I'm continually navigating, and I think it's a difficult thing to put into words because we spent all of my formative years never knowing each other, and um, my birth mom spent my entire childhood and adolescence and into my young adulthood not knowing what had happened to me, and I spent on the other side of it, I spent not knowing if she was even still alive, and to try and navigate a relationship after that, I think will always be have some level of difficulty with a lot of love, of course. And then my relationship with my parents, um, I I love them dearly. And now that I've had a child and they're experiencing being grandparents for the first time, it's been a very special thing to witness. And I would say it has probably um, injected a new dynamic in our relationship that I'm really grateful for, and that I'm really enjoying. And it's helping me see them as parents in a different way as well, which is really nice. And so, um, all I can say is just how much I love all of my parents, and also how relationships are tricky, and that's whether you're adopted or not. So
It's so true. It really is. And your book has been well received in Canada and is now available in the US. And I think that it's going to be very interesting to see how American readers see the book as well. I think that they are going to enjoy it. I think that it's going to be enlightening.
thank you for saying that. I certainly hope so.
Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you for having me. I so appreciate it.
Children Like Us is out now, and you can pick it up here in the US. You've been listening to Chapter Chat. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Happy reading!